In the winter of 1906, a small crew of hard rock miners drove adrift into a granite ridge deep in the Nevada interior, looking for a coal seam that wasn't supposed to be there. They were living on salt pork, coffee that tasted like iron, and the promise of a bonus that would never be paid. The job was standard until the morning their steel picks broke through into a hollow pocket that didn't appear on any survey map. There were carvings on the walls that defied logic, air that smelled of copper and dried blood, and a silence that felt heavy enough to crush a man's chest. Then came the tapping. At first, it was deep in the rock. Then, it was under the floorboards of the bunkhouse. The things beneath that ridge had been waiting a long time for someone to knock. So, before we descend into the dark, please ensure you leave a like and comment down below where you are watching from. It helps the channel more than you know. The taste of coal dust is something you never truly scrub out of your gums. It settles in the back of the throat and stays there, a constant reminder of the earth you are stealing from. I can still taste it now, bitter and sharp, when I think back to that winter in Nevada. We were stationed 30 miles from the nearest settlement, a place that barely qualified as a town. Our site was known as Dry Camp Number 3. It wasn't much more than a scar on the landscape, 4 canvas, walled structures and a tool shed huddled against the wind at the end of a rusted narrow-gauge spur. The wind in that part of the territory didn't blow like normal wind. It stripped the heat right out of your marrow. I had come down from the copper country in Utah, broke and hungry, chasing a rumor that the Nevada hills were hiding a thick vein of anthracite close to the surface. When I arrived, the ground was already frozen hard enough to ring like an anvil under a boot heel. The operation was run by a man named Briggs. He was a short, thick-set man who wore a clean waistcoat and a heavy gold watch chain that looked out of place against the gray scrub brush and the black dust. Briggs was the kind of man who looked at a mountain and saw only a ledger of numbers. He told us we were standing on a fortune. He said we would pull enough coal out of that ridge to retire in a year. He smiled when he said it, his teeth yellow against his clean-shaven face, but I noticed early on that he never stepped foot inside the drift. He stood by the tipple, checking his watch, counting cars, and watching the sun go down from the safety of the open air. There were 6 of us in the crew, not counting Briggs. In a camp that's small, you learn the shape of a man's soul by the way he holds a shovel or the way he breathes in his sleep. I bunked next to Connolly, a tall Irishman with hands the size of spade heads and a beard that grew in patchy clumps on his cheeks. He was the kind of man who filled the silence because he couldn't stand it. He hummed constantly while he worked, low, tuneless melodies that echoed off the rock walls. He made jokes that weren't funny, but we laughed anyway because the sound of human voices was the only thing keeping the vastness of the desert at bay. On the other side of the stove slept Alvarez. He was different. He was older, a veteran of the silver mines in Virginia City, and he moved with the efficient economy of a man who had survived cave-ins and gas pockets. Alvarez didn't talk much, but when he did, you listened. He had dark, hooded eyes that seemed to be constantly measuring the weight of the earth above our heads. He told me on the second night that the coal here smelled wrong. He said it was too dry, too sour. He said the rock felt dead, even for stone. I didn't know what he meant then. I thought it was just superstition, the kind of ghost stories old miners tell to scare the greenhorns. Then there was Sparrow. That wasn't his real name, but it fit him. He was a kid, skinny and twitchy, with wide eyes that darted around like he was expecting to be hit. He claimed he was 18, but he couldn't have been a day over 16. He had lied to get the wage, and Briggs knew it, but Briggs didn't care as long as the boy could load a cart. Sparrow tried hard to act like a man. He chewed tobacco that made him sick and spat on the floor like the rest of us. But I could hear him crying in his sleep sometimes when the wind howled through the gaps in the logs. The last 2 were the Ward brothers, Ellie and Thomas. They were big men, broad in the shoulder and thick in the neck, built from the corn, fed soil of Kansas. They were almost identical, dark-haired and sullen. They kept to themselves, playing cards in the corner of the bunkhouse and smoking cheap, acrid tobacco. They worked like machines. They didn't complain. They didn't joke. and they didn't stop until the bell rang. They were a single unit communicating in nods and grunts. I never saw one without the other. Our routine was a grind that wore us down by inches. We rose before the sun in the blue-black cold of the pre-dawn. Breakfast was a tin plate of beans and hard bread that we had to soak in coffee to chew. The cookhouse was always cold. The wood stove never seemed to generate enough heat to reach the corners of the room. We ate in silence. The only sounds the scraping of spoons on tin and the coughing of men clearing the night's dust from their lungs. After eating, we walked the narrow track up to the mouth of the drift. The entrance was a black maw cut into the side of a gray, imposing ridge that loomed over the camp. The timbers framing the mouth were rough, hewn pine already darkening with rot and moisture. The air inside the tunnel was always the same temperature, cold, still, and dead. It felt separate from the world outside, a sealed environment that didn't care about the seasons. We would take our lamps from the nails near the entrance. These were carbide lamps, simple brass canisters that hissed when the water dripped onto the calcium carbide, producing acetylene gas. The flame was a stark, white light that cast long, sharp shadows. It was a clean light, but it didn't travel far. It stopped abruptly against the rock, creating a small bubble of visibility in an ocean of dark. We checked the wicks, adjusted the water drip, and stepped into the hill. The work was brutal. We were following a seam that dipped sharply downward, forcing us to cut at awkward angles. The air grew heavy the deeper we went. It was thick with dust and the smell of black powder. We drilled holes into the face by hand, one man holding the steel drill bit, the other swinging the sledgehammer. Clang, turn. Clang. Turn. It was a rhythm that got into your blood. Then we would pack the holes with powder, set the fuses, and retreat to the closest cross, cut to wait for the blast. The explosion would thump against your chest, a dull pressure wave that shook dust from the ceiling. Then came the mucking out. We loaded the shattered coal into wooden ore carts and pushed them back up the slope to the entrance. The mules took them from there to the tipple. It was back, breaking labor, stripping the earth away one pick, swing at a time. There were the usual hazards. Roof falls that dropped slabs of slate the size of tabletops, bad air that made your head swim, tempers that flared when a man didn't pull his weight. But it was normal. It was the devil we knew. We understood gravity, we understood rock, we thought we understood the risks. For the first 3 weeks, the only thing we found was coal. The Shoshone families who sometimes camped in the valley below kept their distance. They would come to the edge of the camp to trade deerskin or dried meat with the cook. But they never looked at the mine. They stood with their backs to the ridge. If they spoke, it was in low tones to the interpreter. I didn't pay it much mind at the time. I was focused on the ache in my shoulders and the number of days left until payday. Alvarez was the first to sense the change. It was a Tuesday evening after a particularly long shift. The wind had picked up outside, screaming around the corners of the bunkhouse like a wounded animal. We were all inside, huddled around the stove. The lanterns swayed on their hooks, sending shadows rocking back and forth across the walls. Alvarez was sitting on the edge of his bunk, unlacing his boots. He stopped with one boot in his hand and looked at the floor. "The hill is not solid," he said. He didn't look at us. He was speaking to the floorboards. Connolly looked up from whittling a piece of scrap wood. "What are you on about, Alvarez? It is rock. It is as solid as my mother's biscuits." Alvarez didn't smile. He shook his head slowly. "Number the sound is wrong. When the pick hits the seam, it should go thud, a dead sound. Today, it sounded open, like striking a drum. There are hollows behind the coal. Big ones. Gas pockets," Eli Ward grunted from the corner. "Methane." "Not gas," Alvarez said. He looked up then and his eyes were dark and flat. "Space. Empty space. The rock is old, but the spaces are waiting." Sparrow looked at Alvarez, his eyes wide. "What kind of spaces?" "The kind that shouldn't be there," Alvarez said softly. Briggs would have fired him for talking like that if he had heard it. Bad morale spreads faster than dysentery in a camp like that, but Briggs was in his office counting his imaginary money. We went to sleep that night with the wind shaking the walls, and I remember lying awake, listening to the earth. I told myself it was just the wind. I told myself Alvarez was just tired. 2 days later, the mountain proved him right. We were about 100 yards into the drift, following the seam as it twisted deeper into the ridge. The tunnel was narrow here, barely wide enough for 2 men to stand abreast. I was at the face with Connolly and Sparrow. The air had changed that morning. It had grown warmer, humid, and heavy, sticking to the skin like a damp web. My shirt was plastered to my spine. The lamp light flickered with every swing of the pick, creating a strobe effect on the black walls. I was driving my pick into the lower section of the face, clearing a spot for the next charge. I remember the moment perfectly. I swung the pick, expecting the jarring resistance of hard anthracite. Instead, the point punched through. It didn't chip the rock, it went through it. There was a sound like a ceramic pot cracking, followed by a rush of air. It wasn't a draft, it was an exhale. A blast of cold air rushed out of the hole I had made, flowing over my hands and face. It was dry, incredibly dry, and it smelled. Old didn't smell like methane or sulfur. It smelled like dust that had been sitting in the dark for 1,000 years. It smelled stale and sour, like the air inside a sealed trunk. We all froze. The ringing of the picks stopped instantly. For a moment, there was only the hiss of the acetylene lamps and the heavy breathing of 6 men. "Back up," Connolly said, his voice tight. He stepped up beside me, lowering his lamp. The hole was about the size of a man's head. The edges were jagged, but the darkness beyond it was absolute. It swallowed the light from our lamps. The beam from Connolly's lamp cut into the void and vanished. "It didn't hit a back wall. Is it a vent?" Sparrow asked, his voice cracking. He was standing behind us, gripping his shovel so hard his knuckles were white. "Too big for a vent," I said. I leaned closer, letting the cold air wash over my face. It felt unnatural, a steady pressure pushing out against us. We widened the opening. We had to. It was the only way to see if the seam continued, or if we had hit a fault line. We chipped away at the edges of the breach, knocking loose chunks of coal until the hole was wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The coal here was brittle, flaking away easily, as if it wasn't attached to the structure behind it. Briggs came down 20 minutes later. We had sent Sparrow to fetch him. The manager arrived looking annoyed, his boots clean, a silk scarf tucked into his collar to keep the dust off his neck. He carried a lamp that looked brand new. "Well?" he demanded, staring at the hole. "What is the holdup? We have a schedule." "We broke through, boss," Connolly said, gesturing to the darkness. "There is a cavity, a big one." Briggs stepped forward and peered into the gap. He sniffed the stale air and wrinkled his nose. "A cavern, limestone, probably. Common in these hills." "It is not limestone, boss," Alvarez said from the back. "Limestone is wet, this air is dry, dead dry." Briggs ignored him. He was already calculating. "If it is stable, we can use it. Save us the trouble of hauling waste rock to the surface. We can dump the tailings right in there. Might even be able to timber it for storage." He turned to us, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "I want a survey. I want to know how deep it goes and if the coal seam picks up on the other side. You, and you," he pointed to me, Connolly, and Thomas Ward. "Get a rope, get in there. The rest of you widen this breach and brace the roof. I don't want a cave in sealing our new storage room." Alvarez shook his head. "Mr. Briggs, we should check for gas first." "We should send a canary." "The air is blowing out, Alvarez," Briggs snapped. "If there was gas, we'd be choking on it already." "It is just a vacuum equalizing. Now move. I want a report before the shift ends." We did as we were told. We were paid to dig, not to argue. But as I strapped the coil of hemp rope over my shoulder and looked into that black hole, I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. The silence pouring out of that void wasn't empty. It felt attentive. We stripped off our heavy coats to avoid snagging on the jagged coal. I went first. I eased my legs through the hole, feeling for the floor on the other side. My boots touched down on something solid. It wasn't rock. It felt like packed earth, smooth and hard. I ducked my head and pushed my upper body through. The cold air enveloped me completely now. I stood up and raised my lamp. I wasn't standing in a natural cavern. The light revealed a chamber. The ceiling was low, forcing me to hunch slightly. The walls didn't look like the rough, fractured stone of a natural cave. They curved away into the darkness with a disturbing symmetry. The floor was flat, perfectly flat. "Clear," I called back, my voice sounding muffled and dead in the stagnant air. Connolly came through next, followed by Thomas. We stood there in a tight cluster, our 3 lamps combining to push back the dark. The chamber was oval-shaped, maybe 30 feet across. "Jesus," Connolly whispered. In the center of the room, rising from the floor to the ceiling, was a pillar. It wasn't coal and it wasn't granite. It was a pale yellowish stone, smooth to the touch, polished like marble. But it was the markings that stopped my heart. The surface of the pillar was covered in carvings. They weren't the crude petroglyphs I had seen on cliff faces near the Utah border. These were precise, sharp, angular lines cut deep into the stone. They intersected in complex geometric patterns, triangles, diamonds, and long, sweeping curves that looked like rib cages. Thomas Ward walked up to the pillar. He reached out a massive, calloused hand and traced one of the lines. "This ain't natural," he said. His voice was low, a rumble in his chest. "No water did this." I walked past the pillar to the far side of the chamber. The air was even colder here. My lamp illuminated a dark opening in the wall, a tunnel, leading downward at a steep angle. Unlike the rough drift we had cut, this tunnel was smooth. The walls looked like they had been fused, melted into shape by immense heat. I looked down at the floor near the entrance to this new tunnel. The dust there was thick, undisturbed for centuries. But as I lowered my lamp, I saw something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Impressions. They were faint, but they were there. A trail of depressions in the dust leading from the tunnel into the room and back again. They weren't boot prints. They weren't hoof prints. I crouched down to get a better look. The shape was narrow at the heel, splaying out into 3 distinct points at the toe, and deeper alongside the prints were drag marks, thin, parallel lines, as if something heavy with a long tail had been pulled, or had pulled itself across the floor. "Hey," Connolly called out. "Look at this." I turned. Connolly was standing near the base of the pillar. He was holding something up to the light. It looked like a strip of dried parchment, translucent and brittle. "Found it wedged in the corner," he said. I walked over. The object wasn't paper. It was organic. It crinkled as he held it. It was pale, almost clear, with a texture of fine scales. It looked like the shed skin of a snake, but it was too thick, and the scales were the size of thumbnails. "A snake?" I asked, though I knew no snake grew that large in the high desert. "Maybe," Connolly said. He sounded unconvinced. He dropped the skin. It hit the floor with a dry scratch. Or something else. We stood there in the silence, the 3 of us. The only sound was the hiss of the lamps and the distant, muffled noise of the crew working on the breach behind us. And then we heard it. It came from the smooth tunnel that led down into the dark. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It wasn't water dripping. It was the sound of stone striking stone. Deliberate, rhythmic. It stopped. We held our breath. I gripped the handle of my pick until my hand ached. Tap, tap. It was closer this time. "We need to get Briggs," I whispered. My throat felt dry as sand. Thomas didn't say anything. He just stared into the black mouth of the tunnel, his eyes wide, his body tense as a coiled spring. We backed away, moving toward the exit hole, keeping our eyes on the dark. We didn't know what was down there, but we knew one thing for certain. We weren't the first ones to use this room, and whoever, or whatever, had carved that pillar, they were still home. We backed out of that chamber with our lamps held high, stepping backward over the loose coal until we reached the breach. No one spoke until we were back in the rough, hewn safety of the main drift, where the air still smelled of black powder and sweat. Connolly leaned against a timber support, wiping coal dust from his forehead with a trembling hand. The silence from the void behind us was absolute again. The tapping had stopped, but the rhythm of it, 2 sharp strikes, a pause, 2 more stayed in my ears. It felt intelligent. It felt like a code. We found Briggs waiting at the junction where the ore carts were staged. He was pacing, checking his watch, impatient with the interruption to his schedule. When he saw our faces, he stopped. He didn't ask what we found. He asked if the space was usable. "It is a room, boss," Connolly said. His voice was flat. "But it is not natural. Someone cut it, and there is things in there." Briggs frowned, the skin around his eyes tightening. "Things? What kind of things?" "Indian pottery, gold, stone," Thomas Ward said. "And skin." Briggs scoffed, a short, sharp sound in the damp air. He grabbed a lantern from the hook and signaled for us to follow him back. He wasn't a man who believed in ghost stories. He believed in geology and profit margins. To him, a hole in the rock was either a hazard or an asset, and he intended to find out which. He ordered Sparrow to come with us, handing the boy a slate chalkboard and a stick of charcoal. "Map it," Briggs said. "If we're going to timber it for storage, I want dimensions." We walked back to the breach. Sparrow looked pale, his eyes darting toward the shadows, but he fell in line. We squeezed back through the opening, the cold, stale air hitting us again like a physical weight. Inside the chamber, the light from Briggs's lamp joined ours, pushing the shadows back against the curved walls. Briggs walked straight to the center pillar. He ran a gloved hand over the pale, smooth stone. He didn't recoil. He leaned in, studying the geometric carvings with the eye of a man assessing the value of a cut diamond. "Basalt," he muttered. "Maybe polished granite. Hard to tell with this dust." He traced one of the sharp intersecting lines. "This isn't Shoshone work. It is too precise. Looks industrial." "It is old, boss," I said. "Look at the floor." I pointed my light at the thick layer of dust near the base of the pillar. The tracks we had seen earlier were still there, stark and impossible. The 3-toed depressions, the drag marks. Briggs lowered his lamp. He stared at the prints for a long time. He didn't say they were impossible. He didn't say they were a hoax. He just stared, his jaw working silently. "Draft," he said finally. "Air currents moving the dust, makes strange shapes." "With toes?" Connolly asked. Briggs spun on him. "I said it is a draft. We're 100 feet underground. There are no lizards down here, Connolly. Use your head." He pointed to the dark tunnel leading down. "How far does that go?" "We didn't check," I said. "We heard noises tapping." Briggs listened. The chamber was silent. "I hear nothing. Rats probably, or settling rock." He turned to Sparrow. "Draw the pillar, get the dimensions of the floor, Ward. Check the roof stability. I want to know if we can stack crates in here without the ceiling coming down." We spent the next hour in that cold, dead room. It was the longest hour of my life. Sparrow sat on a loose rock, his hands shaking as he sketched the pillar. He tried to capture the angles of the carvings, but the geometry seemed to hurt the eyes if you looked at it too long. It didn't follow the rules of perspective. The lines seemed to twist inward, while Briggs measured the walls. I went back to the piece of skin Connolly had found. It was still there, lying in the dust. I picked it up. It was light, almost weightless, but tough. It didn't tear. It felt like dried parchment made of gristle. The scales were translucent, fading from a dull yellow to a milky white. I held it up to my lamp. There were tiny veins running through it, dried black lines that formed a web. Alvarez had stayed near the entrance, refusing to come fully into the room. When I walked over and showed him the skin, he crossed himself. "Burn it," he whispered. "It is not from a beast of God." "Briggs thinks it is a draft," I said. "Briggs is a fool," Alvarez said, his voice barely audible. "He looks at the dark and sees a bank vault." When the measurements were done, we packed up. Briggs took the slate from Sparrow and looked at the drawing. He nodded, satisfied. "We'll brace the entrance tomorrow," he said. "This is good dry storage, saves us building a new shed up top." He put the piece of shed skin in his coat pocket, not as a curiosity, but as a sample to be analyzed later, like a core sample of ore. We left the chamber. We didn't talk about the tapping, but as we squeezed back into the mine drift, I looked back one last time. The darkness in the downward tunnel seemed thicker than before. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence, and I knew with the certainty of a man who has lived his life sensing the mood of the earth, that we had been watched every second we were in there. We finished the shift in silence. When we emerged from the drift, the sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. The wind had died down, leaving a strange, hanging stillness over the camp. That evening, the Shoshone interpreter returned. He was a man named Miller, a half-breed who traded goods between the reservation and the mining camps. He usually came alone, bringing mail or whiskey, but this time he was not alone. An elder stood with him, a man so old his face looked like a topographic map of the Badlands. His hair was white braids, and he wore a heavy buffalo hide coat despite the relative warmth of the evening stove. They stood at the edge of the camp, near the cookhouse, waiting. They didn't approach the office. They just stood there, motionless, looking at the ridge. Briggs saw them through the window of his shack. He came out, wiping grease from his mouth with a napkin. He was in a good mood. The storage room had improved his outlook. He walked over to them, his gait confident. "Miller," Briggs said, "I didn't order any supplies. If you are looking to sell, come back on payday." Miller didn't smile. He looked nervous. He kept glancing at the elder. "We're not here to trade, Mr. Briggs. He wanted to speak to you." The elder spoke then. His voice was a dry rasp, like leaves dragging over stone. He spoke in his own tongue, his eyes fixed on the mine entrance up the slope. He pointed a gnarled finger at the ridge, then made a sweeping motion across the ground, palm down. Miller swallowed hard. "He says you have opened the throat." Briggs laughed. "We opened a coal seam, Miller. That is what we do." The elder spoke again, more urgently this time. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Briggs. The intensity in his gaze made Briggs take a half step back. "He says the mountain is not empty," Miller translated. "He says there are old ones who sleep in the deep veins. They do not like the light. They do not like the iron." Miller paused, searching for the right words. "He says when the earth sleeps, they move. You must close the hole. You must leave this place before the moon turns." Briggs's face hardened. He hated superstition. He hated anything that threatened his timeline. "Tell him this is company land. We have a deed. We have rights to every ounce of mineral from the surface to the core. Tell him to take his ghost stories back to the fire." The elder didn't need the translation. He understood the tone. He looked at Briggs with a mixture of pity and contempt. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch made of dyed leather, tied with sinew. He dropped it at Briggs's feet. It hit the dust with a soft thud. "He says this is for the dead," Miller said quietly. "He says you are already dead men walking. He will not come back." The elder turned and walked away into the twilight. Miller lingered for a second, looking at us, the crew standing by the bunkhouse door, with an apologetic grimace. Then he followed the old man. Briggs stared at the pouch. He kicked it. It skidded across the dirt and stopped near the tool shed. "Get back to work," he barked at us. "I don't pay you to watch a medicine show." He stormed back into his office and slammed the door. We didn't go back to work. The shift was over. We went into the bunkhouse, but the mood had shifted. The air inside felt too thin. Sparrow sat on his bunk, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the door. "What did he mean?" Sparrow asked. "Dead men walking." "It is just talk, kid," Connolly said, but he was sharpening his knife with a manic intensity. Scrape, scrape, scrape. "They just want us to leave so they can scavenge the scrap metal." Alvarez was sitting on the floor melting candle wax onto a piece of string. "The Shoshone do not lie about the earth," he said. "They know what lives in the cracks." Thomas Ward stood by the window watching the ridge. "Something's moving up there," he said. We all looked. It was too dark to see clearly, but the silhouette of the ridge looked jagged against the stars. It looked like the spine of a sleeping beast, and for a second, just a second, I thought I saw a shadow detach itself from the mine entrance and slip into the rocks. "Coyote," Ellie said. No one argued. But that night we locked the bunkhouse door from the inside. We had never done that before. The horror didn't start with a scream. It started with a sound. It was 2 nights after the survey. The camp was quiet. The wind had died completely, leaving a silence so profound you could hear the blood rushing in your ears. I was awake, staring at the rough logs of the ceiling, trying not to think about the debt I owed back in Utah. Then I heard it. Tap, tap. It was faint, barely a vibration. But it was distinct. It came from outside, from the direction of the ridge. I sat up. Connolly was already awake. He was looking at me, his eyes wide in the gloom. Tap, tap. It wasn't random. It was a measure, a query. "You hear that?" Connolly whispered. "Yea," we listened. The sound stopped for a long time. Minutes passed. I began to think I had imagined it, that the silence was playing tricks on a tired mind. Then it came again, louder. Tap, tap, closer. It wasn't at the ridge anymore. It was at the edge of the camp, near the pile of tailings we had dumped yesterday. It sounded like hard stones striking wood. Sparrow whimpered in his sleep. Alvarez crossed himself in the dark. The sound moved. It circled the camp. It was methodical. It would tap twice, wait for 10 seconds, and then tap twice again from a location 20 feet to the right. It was testing the perimeter. It was checking for weaknesses. We sat there in the dark, 6 grown men, paralyzed by a noise. We had dynamite in the shed. We had picks and shovels. We had fists that could break rock. But this was different. This was a sound that bypassed the rational part of the brain and went straight to the lizard brain, the part that remembers when we were prey. And then it changed. The tapping stopped circling. There was a long silence, maybe 5 minutes. The tension in the room was tight enough to snap a cable. Then, right beneath my boots, under the floorboards of the bunkhouse, tap, tap. It was soft, gentle even, like a fingernail clicking against the wood. My blood ran cold. The bunkhouse was built on raised piers to keep it off the frozen ground. There was a crawl space underneath, maybe 2 feet high, dark, tight, full of spiders and dust. Something was under us. Connolly swung his legs off the bunk and grabbed his pickaxe. He stood in the middle of the room, staring at the floor. Tap, tap. It moved. It was under Alvarez's bunk now. Tap, tap. It was under Sparrow. The boy woke up. He didn't scream. He just gasped, a sharp intake of air like he had been punched. He looked down at the mattress, his eyes bulging. He could feel it. The vibration was traveling up through the wood frame of the bed. "Don't move," Alvarez whispered. "Do not move." We waited. The tapping continued for an hour. It explored the underside of the floor. It tapped at the corners. It tapped at the center. It was mapping the structure from below. It was learning where we slept. It wasn't aggressive. Not yet. It was curious. It was the sound of a scientist tapping on the glass of a specimen jar. Eventually, the sun began to bleed gray light through the cracks in the walls. The tapping stopped. We heard a soft, dry, shuffling sound like sandpaper on dirt, moving away toward the ridge. When we finally opened the door and stepped out into the blinding morning light, we checked the crawl space. We didn't want to, but we had to know. Connolly lay on his stomach and shone a light under the building. "Well?" I asked. He pulled himself out. His face was pale, dusty. He looked at me and I saw a fear in him that I had never seen in a man before. "Nothing," he said. "No tracks, no animals." But I pressed. "The wood," he said. "The underside of the floor joists, they're scratched, deep." He held up a splinter of pine. It had been gouged out. Whatever was down there, Connolly said, his voice shaking. It was testing the beams. It wanted to know how much weight they could hold. Briggs came out of his office then, looking well rested. He saw us gathered around the crawl space. "What is the meeting about?" he demanded. "Get up to the drift. We have quotas." I looked at the ridge. The black mouth of the mine looked different now. It didn't look like a hole in the rock. It looked like an eye, open and staring. "We heard things last night, Briggs," Thomas Ward said. "Under the floor. Rats," Briggs said dismissively. "Badgers. It is the desert. Things crawl." "Badgers don't tap in code," I said. Briggs stopped. He looked at me, and for a moment the mask slipped. I saw the uncertainty behind his eyes. He had heard it too. He had to have heard it. His shack was only 20 yards away. "Get to work," he said, but his voice lacked its usual snap. "And take the rifles, just in case of coyotes." We walked up the track to the mine. The sun felt cold. The air felt thin, and every time my boot hit the ground, I felt the earth waiting for a response. Tap, tap. The morning sun did nothing to warm the camp. It hung in the sky like a pale coin, offering light but no heat. We stood at the mouth of the drift, our breath pluming in the air, while Briggs paced back and forth in front of us. He held his revolver in one hand and a new carbide lamp in the other. He looked tired. The skin under his eyes was the color of bruised fruit, but his jaw was set in a line of stubborn refusal. He wasn't going to let a noise in the dark cost him his claim. "We go back in," Briggs said. It wasn't a question. "We finish the survey. We check the lower tunnel. If there is nothing there, we get back to cutting coal. If there is something, well, that is what the gun is for." Alvarez spat on the frozen ground. "You cannot shoot a mountain boss." Briggs ignored him. He pointed the barrel at me, then Connolly, then Thomas. "You three. You've seen it. You lead. Sparrow, stay here with the mules. Alvarez, you and Eli stand guard at the entrance. If you see so much as a coyote, you fire." Clear we didn't argue. In 1906, you didn't argue with the man who signed the checks, not when you were 30 miles from the nearest water pump. We checked our lamps, tightened our belts, and walked back into the dark. The air inside the mine felt different now before. It had been just stale now. It was heavy. It pressed against our eardrums. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. We reached the breach in the wall and squeezed through into the carved chamber. The pillar stood in the center, the geometric lines seeming to shift in the flickering light of our lamps. "Down," Briggs said, gesturing to the smooth, sloping tunnel on the far side. We moved in single file. I took the lead, holding my lamp high. The floor of the lower tunnel was smooth, polished by centuries of friction. It angled steeply downward, spiraling into the roots of the ridge. The air grew warmer here. It smelled of sulfur and something else, something sharp and metallic like wet pennies. We descended for maybe 200 yards. The tunnel didn't branch. It was a single, direct throat leading to the stomach of the hill. The walls here changed composition. The coal and granite gave way to a dark, non-reflective stone that seemed to absorb the light. "Hold up," I whispered. The tunnel opened up into a second chamber. This one was smaller than the first, but the ceiling was higher, lost in the gloom above. The floor was uneven, cluttered with debris. Briggs pushed past me, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. He raised his lamp. The floor was covered in bones. They weren't human. They were small rodents, coyotes, maybe a mountain lion. They were dry and brittle, snapping under our weight. But it wasn't the bones that stopped us. It was the tracks. The dust here was churned up, a chaotic mess of prints. The same 3 towed depressions we had seen above, but hundreds of them. They crisscrossed the room, layering over each other, and among them were the drag marks. Wide, smooth furrows in the dust, as if heavy sacks had been pulled across the floor. "Jesus," Connolly hissed. "It is a highway. Look at the walls," Thomas said. We looked. Along the perimeter of the room, carved directly into the rock face, were alcoves. perfectly rectangular, spaced 3 feet apart. They looked like bunks or shelves. They were empty, but the edges were worn smooth, as if hands or claws had gripped them repeatedly over a long span of time. Briggs walked to the center of the room. There was a stone structure there. It wasn't a pillar, it was a trough. It was carved from the same black stone as the walls, about 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. It stood waist high. The workmanship was exquisite, the edges sharp and precise. It looked like an altar or a feeding bucket. Briggs leaned over it. He held his lamp over the basin. "What is it?" I asked, staying back near the entrance. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. The air here was thick with that copper smell. Briggs didn't answer. He reached out a hand and touched the bottom of the trough. He rubbed his thumb against his fingers, then brought his hand close to his face. He went rigid. "Boss." Connolly stepped forward. Briggs turned slowly. His face was the color of ash. He held his hand out toward us. His fingers were wet. In the stark white light of the carbide flame, the substance on his hand gleamed. It was red, bright, crimson red. It wasn't dust, it wasn't rust. It was blood, and it wasn't old. It was viscous, it was warm. "It is fresh," Briggs whispered, his voice trembling. "It is warm." A sound came from the tunnel beyond the chamber. A tunnel we hadn't seen yet, hidden in the shadows of the far wall. Click hiss. It sounded like a massive intake of breath through wet cartilage. We didn't wait for an order. The panic hit us all at once, a physical blow. Briggs turned and ran, almost tripping over the trough. I spun around, grabbing Connolly by the jacket as he froze. Thomas was already moving, his massive frame barreling toward the exit slope. We scrambled up that smooth, polished tunnel like rats fleeing a rising tide. Our boots slipped on the stone. Our breathing was ragged, loud, filling the space. I expected to feel claws on my back at any second. I expected the dark to grow teeth. We burst into the upper chamber, then through the breach, and finally into the rough safety of the mine drift. We didn't stop running until we hit the daylight. We collapsed on the tailings pile, gasping for air. The sun was still there, the world was still there. But everything had changed. The blood on Briggs's hand had dried to a dark, crusty brown, but the reality of it was burned into our minds. "Seal it," Briggs said, clutching his chest. "Collapse the drift. Use the dynamite. Blow the whole damn entrance." "With the tools inside?" Alvarez asked, looking at our empty hands. "Forget the tools," Briggs screamed. "Blow it. We spent the afternoon setting charges." We packed enough dynamite into the timber frames to bring down half the hillside. When we blew it, the sound rolled across the valley like thunder. The entrance collapsed in a cloud of dust and splintered wood. The drift was gone. The breach was sealed. We thought that would be the end of it. We thought stone could stop them. We were wrong. Night fell like a hammer. The wind died completely, leaving the camp in a vacuum of silence. We huddled in the bunkhouse, the door barred with a heavy plank, the window shutters nailed shut. Briggs sat at the small table, his revolver stripped and cleaned, reassembled and loaded. He stared at the weapon as if it were a religious artifact. Thomas sat on his bunk, staring at nothing. He hadn't spoken since we left the lower chamber. Eli sat beside him, cleaning his fingernails with a knife over and over until the skin was raw. At midnight, the sound returned. It didn't come from the ridge. The ridge was silent, a tomb of broken rock. The sound came from directly beneath us. Tap, tap, it was loud, urgent. It vibrated through the heels of my boots. Tap, tap. "They're digging," Connolly whispered. "They're under the piers." "They can't be," Briggs said, but he raised the gun. "It is solid ground." "It is not solid," Alvarez said from the corner. "I told you. The hill is hollow. The veins run everywhere." The tapping moved. It traveled the length of the bunkhouse, sounding out the joists. Then it stopped. A new sound replaced it. A slow, rhythmic scraping, scree. Scree like a file on metal they were cutting. "They're coming through the floor," Sparrow whimpered. He scurried up to the top bunk, pressing himself against the roof logs. Eli stood up. He dropped his knife. His face was slack, his eyes wide and unseeing. He looked like a man who had suddenly remembered something important he had left outside. "Eli," Thomas said. Eli didn't answer. He walked to the door. He moved with a stiff, jerky gait. "Eli, get away from there," Briggs shouted, standing up. Eli reached for the bar. "Don't open it," I yelled. Eli lifted the heavy wooden plank with one hand. Effortlessly, he threw it aside. It clattered to the floor. He unlatched the door and threw it open. The cold night air rushed in. The darkness outside was absolute. Eli stepped out onto the small porch. He stood there for a second, silhouetted against the stars. He looked toward the tool shed. "I hear them," he said. His voice was calm, conversational. "They want the iron." Then he screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of pure biological overload. A sound a human throat makes when the mind simply snaps. He collapsed forward, falling face first into the dirt. Thomas roared and charged out after him. We followed, lamps held high, Briggs bringing up the rear with the gun. We found E lying in the dirt 5 feet from the steps. He wasn't bleeding. There were no marks on him, but his face was frozen in a rictus of terror so profound it distorted his features. His eyes were open, capillaries burst, turning the whites red. His heart had simply stopped. "Eli," Thomas shook him. "Eli, wake up." There was no pulse. The body was already cooling. "Get him inside," Briggs yelled, scanning the darkness with the gun barrel. "Get him inside now." "No," Thomas said. He stood up, lifting his brother's massive frame in his arms as if he weighed nothing. "Not inside. He needs space." "Thomas, don't be a fool," I said. "Whatever killed him is still out here." "The shed," Thomas said. He walked toward the tool shed, carrying the body. "I'll put him on the table." He hated the bunkhouse, said it smelled of sweat. He walked away from us. We stood there, exposed, lamps creating a fragile circle of light. I felt eyes on us, not from the ridge, but from the scrub brush, from the creek bed, from the shadows between the tents. We escorted Thomas to the shed. He laid Allie out on the workbench. He crossed his brother's hands over his chest. Then he sat down on a crate beside the body. He pulled his skinning knife from his belt. "I am staying," Thomas said. "You can't," Briggs said. "We stick together. That is the only way we survive the night." "Go," Thomas said. He didn't look at us. He looked at the door. "They're coming for him. I'll be waiting." We tried to argue. We tried to pull him out, but Thomas was 6'4" and built of granite. He wouldn't move, and the darkness outside the shed was pressing in thick and heavy. We left him there. We ran back to the bunkhouse, barred the door again, and waited. For 2 hours, nothing happened. The silence stretched until it felt like a wire tightening around our throats. Then, just before 3 a.m., the tool shed woke up. It started with a thud, a heavy impact against the side of the shed, then another, then the sound of wood splintering. Thomas didn't scream. We heard him shouting, a deep, guttural war cry. We heard the crash of metal tools falling. We heard the heavy thwack of a knife hitting wood or bone. "We have to help him," Connolly said, grabbing his pick. "Stay put," Briggs yelled. "You go out there, you die." "He is my friend," Connolly shouted. He shoved Briggs aside and unbarred the door. I grabbed my lamp and followed him. I couldn't let him go alone. Alvarez grabbed a shovel. Briggs cursed, but he came to. We ran toward the shed. The structure was shaking. The walls were vibrating from impacts on the inside and the outside. We stopped 10 yards away. The light from our lamps cut through the gloom. And then we saw them. They were shadows. They were solid. They were real. There were 3 of them standing around the shed. They turned to look at us as we approached. They stood on 2 legs upright, but their posture was wrong. They leaned forward, their spines curved, balancing on powerful digitigrade legs. They were tall, 7 feet, maybe more. Their skin was pale, a sickly grayish, green like the belly of a dead fish. It looked dry and rough, covered in tiny interlocking scales. But it was their faces that froze the blood in my veins. They didn't have snouts. They had flat, vertical faces. The eyes were set wide apart, large and black, with no whites, reflecting the lamplight like polished obsidian. They didn't blink. The mouth was a thin slit that wrapped around the sides of the head. They weren't naked beasts. That was the thing that made my mind reject what I was seeing. They wore things. The one closest to us had a harness made of some dark, woven material across its chest. Hanging from it were tools, or weapons, made of that same black, non-reflective stone we had seen in the tunnel. Hooked blades, serrated spikes. They didn't roar, they didn't hiss, they just watched us. They stood with a terrifying, absolute stillness. A mountain lion twitches its tail. A wolf bares its teeth. These things did nothing, they assessed us. They calculated the distance. They calculated the threat. The creature in the center, the largest one, held a weapon in its hand. It looked like a spear, but the tip was a glowing, translucent crystal. It raised the weapon slowly. Inside the shed, the sounds of struggle ceased abruptly. Thomas was gone, or dead. The creature lowered its head slightly. It made a sound, a series of rapid, high-pitched clicks. Click, click, click-tee-tay. The other two moved. They didn't run, they flowed. It was a fluid, liquid motion, incredibly fast but perfectly controlled. They flanked us. Briggs raised his revolver. His hand was shaking so badly the barrel was vibrating. Back! He screamed. Get back! He fired. The shot rang out, a deafening crack in the silent night. The bullet hit the lead creature in the shoulder. A spray of dark fluid erupted from the impact. The creature didn't fall. It didn't even stumble. It looked at the wound, then looked back at Briggs. There was no anger in its eyes, only a cold, clinical indifference. It took a step forward, then another. Run, Alvarez whispered. Run to the water. The creature raised its weapon. We turned and ran. We ran for our lives, leaving the shed, leaving Thomas, leaving everything we knew behind in the dark. And as we ran, I could hear them behind us, not running, pacing, hurting. They weren't hunting us for food. They were evicting us. The gunshot echoed in the valley, a flat, hard crack that seemed small against the sheer mass of the ridge. The bullet struck the lead creature high in the chest, near the shoulder joint. A spray of dark fluid hit the dirt, but the impact didn't even make the thing stumble. It didn't flinch. It didn't roar in pain. It simply absorbed the kinetic energy as if it were made of something denser than meat and bone. Briggs stood there, his arm extended, the smoke drifting from the barrel of his revolver. His face was a mask of disbelief. He cocked the hammer again, his thumb slipping on the metal. Die, he whispered. Just die. He fired a second time. The shot went wide, kicking up dust at the creature's feet. The creature moved. It wasn't the lunge of a predator. It was a blur of calculated motion that the human eye couldn't track. 1 second, it was standing 5 yards away. The next, it was inside Briggs's guard. It didn't strike with a closed fist. It whipped its arm out in a backhanded arc, the long hooked claws extending like switchblades. The sound was wet and sharp, like a butcher slicing through a side of beef. Briggs screamed, a high, ragged sound that cut through the night. The pistol flew from his hand and landed in the scrub brush. He staggered back, clutching his right arm. The sleeve of his heavy wool coat had been shredded. Beneath the fabric, the flesh of his forearm was laid open to the bone. 3 parallel cuts, surgical in their precision, ran from elbow to wrist. Blood pumped out in rhythmic spurts, black in the moonlight. Back! Connolly yelled, swinging his pickaxe in a wide arc to keep them at bay. Get him back. I grabbed Briggs by his collar and hauled him backward. He was dead weight, his legs giving out from the shock. Alvarez stepped in, thrusting his shovel like a spear. But the creatures didn't press the attack. That was the terrifying part. They didn't swarm us. The lead creature, the one Briggs had shot, simply stepped back. It looked at the dark blood oozing from its shoulder, then looked at us. It made a sharp, clicking sound with its throat. TK, TK. The other two creatures moved to its flanks. They formed a line, a phalanx. They were cutting off our path to the ridge, cutting off any return to the mine or the upper camp. They were pushing us toward the creek, toward the valley floor. They were hurting us. They want us out, Alvarez hissed, backing away with his eyes locked on the pale shapes. They are clearing the nest. We retreated. We didn't have a choice. We dragged Briggs through the dirt, his blood leaving a dark trail that the creatures ignored. They matched our pace, step for step. They stayed just at the edge of the lamplight, 3 tall, gray ghosts with obsidian eyes. Every time we slowed down, they advanced. Every time we moved, they held their distance. It was a display of absolute dominance. They knew they could kill us whenever they wanted. They were choosing not to. We reached the edge of the creek. The water was low but fast, moving and freezing cold. The stones were slick with algae. "Cross it," I told Connolly. "Get Sparrow across." Sparrow was sobbing quietly, his body shaking so hard he could barely walk. Connolly grabbed him by the back of his shirt and shoved him toward the water. "Move, kid. Don't look back." We splashed into the creek. The water bit into our legs like knives. I had Briggs's good arm over my shoulder. He was groaning, his face pale and slick with sweat. "My claim," he mumbled, delirious. "It is my claim." "Shut up, Briggs," I said. "Walk." We scrambled up the far bank, slipping on the mud. We were soaking wet, freezing, and exhausted. We clustered together at the top of a small rise about 50 yards from the camp. "Thomas," Connolly said. He stopped and turned back. We left Thomas. We looked back across the creek. The camp was illuminated by the spill of light from the open door of the tool shed, where Thomas had stayed with Eli's body. The rest of the camp was dark, but we could see the silhouettes of the creatures. They hadn't followed us across the water. They had stopped at the creek bank. They stood there for a moment, watching us go, ensuring we were leaving their territory. Then, as one, they turned and walked toward the tool shed. They didn't run. They walked with a terrifying purpose. "Thomas," Connolly cupped his hands around his mouth and screamed, "Get out! They're coming!" His voice echoed off the ridge, but there was no answer from the shed. We watched in helpless silence. The 3 creatures reached the shed. They didn't smash the walls. They didn't tear the roof off. The lead creature reached out with a long, clawed hand and grasped the edge of the door. It pushed the door open gently. The light from the lantern inside spilled out, casting a long rectangle of yellow onto the dirt. We saw Thomas's shadow on the wall. He was sitting on the crate, his head bowed, his brother's body on the table behind him. He didn't move. He didn't raise his knife. The creatures filed into the shed, one by one. They blocked the light. "Don't look," Alvarez said to Sparrow. He turned the boy away. I couldn't look away. I waited for the scream. I waited for the sound of a struggle, for a gunshot, for anything. There was nothing. The shed went silent. Then the lantern inside was extinguished. The rectangle of light vanished. The camp was plunged into total darkness. There was no sound of eating, no sound of tearing flesh, just a heavy final silence that settled over the valley like a shroud. Thomas Ward and his brother were gone. The door was closed. "They are gone," Alvarez said softly. He made the sign of the cross. "They belong to the mountain now. We have to go," I said. My voice sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else. "If we stay here, we freeze." We turned our backs on the camp and began the long walk to the railhead. The trek took us 2 days. We had no food, no water, and only the clothes on our backs. We walked along the rusted tracks of the spur line, stumbling over the ties. The wind picked up, driving grit into our eyes, drying out our throats until we couldn't speak. Briggs got worse by the hour. By dawn of the first day, he couldn't walk. Connolly and I took turns carrying him on a makeshift litter we made from our coats and 2 saplings. The wound on his arm had changed. It wasn't just bleeding anymore. The flesh around the cuts had turned a vivid, angry purple. Veins of black discoloration were spreading up his bicep toward his shoulder. It smelled. It didn't smell like gangrene or rot. It smelled like the air in that lower chamber, metallic, sour, ancient. "It is burning," Briggs whispered. His eyes were glassy, fever bright. "It is burning the blood." By the second night he was hallucinating. He talked about cities of glass under the desert. He talked about the tapping. He said they were knocking on the inside of his skull. "Let them in," he gibbered. "They just want the iron. They need the iron for the ships." He died just before we reached the water tower at the main junction. It wasn't a peaceful death. He seized up, his back arching, his jaw clamped shut so hard he cracked a tooth. Then he went limp. When we checked him, the black veins had reached his neck. We left his body wrapped in a canvas sheet near the water tower. We were too weak to dig a grave in the frozen ground. We reached the telegraph station at sunup. The operator, a man named Henderson, looked at us like we were ghosts. We were covered in coal dust and dried blood. Sparrow had stopped speaking entirely. Alvarez looked 10 years older. "Get the marshal," I told Henderson, "and get the doctor." We sat on the wooden floor of the station and drank water until we vomited. We didn't talk to each other. There was nothing to say. We had survived, but we had left our souls back in that hollow ridge. The authorities arrived 2 days later, a U.S. Marshal from Carson City and a team of deputies. They took our statements separately. We told them everything. We told them about the hollow coal, the carvings, the tracks, the tapping. We told them about the creatures that stood like men and cut like surgeons. The marshal wrote it all down. He didn't look up. He didn't ask questions. He just scribbled on his pad, his face impassive. "Lizard men," he said finally, tapping his pencil on the paper. 7 feet tall, wearing tools. "Yes," I said, "and they killed Briggs and the Ward brothers." "Yes," he looked at me then. His eyes were hard. "You know how this sounds, son. It sounds like you boys found a bottle of bad whiskey and got into a knife fight over a card game." "Go to the ridge," I said. "Look at the mine. Look at the tracks. Look at Briggs's arm. The doctor saw it. The doctor had seen it. He had examined Briggs's body before they buried him. He had noted the infection. He had called it anomalous necrosis. He said he had never seen tissue die that fast. But the doctor was a drunk, and his word didn't carry much weight with the law. They rode out to dry camp number 3 a week later. They took a posse of 20 men heavily armed. They forced me and Connolly to go with them as guides. Alvarez refused. He said he would rather hang than go back there. Sparrow was in a fever fugue at the boarding house. We rode in silence. I dreaded what we would find. I dreaded seeing the bodies. I dreaded seeing the creatures again. But when we crested the final rise and looked down into the valley, I stopped my horse. The camp was gone. "This is the spot?" the marshal asked, looking at me. "It was here," I said. "The bunkhouse was there. The tool shed was there, the tipple. There was nothing, no buildings, no tipple. The ground had been swept clean, not just cleared, scoured. The sagebrush was gone. The dirt was churned and flat. We rode down to the site. I looked for the foundations. I looked for the trash pile. I looked for the blood. There was nothing. It was as if the camp had never existed." "Where is the mine?" the marshal asked. I pointed to the ridge, up there, the drift mouth. We rode up the track. The track was gone too. The rails had been pulled up. Not a spike remained. When we reached the base of the cliff, my heart stopped. The entrance to the drift was gone. The entire face of the ridge had collapsed. Tons of rock had been brought down, sealing the opening under a massive landslide of granite and shale. It looked natural. It looked like the mountain had simply shrugged and closed its eye. "Well," the marshal said, sitting back in his saddle, "looks like a rock slide took out your operation. Probably buried your friends, too." "The buildings," Connolly said. "Where are the buildings? A rock slide doesn't eat a bunkhouse." The marshal looked at the ground. He leaned down and picked up something from the dirt. He held it up. It was a single rusted nail. "Wind," the marshal said. "Wind blows hard out here, scatters things." He looked at us. "Here is what I think happened. I think you boys had a cave-in. Briggs and the wards got buried. You panicked, you ran. The exposure got to your heads, you made up a story to cover your guilt. Guilt, I said, we didn't kill them. Accidents happen, the marshal said. He turned his horse. Case closed. Accidental death due to mining mishap. I'll file the paperwork. They rode away. We stood there for a long time, Connolly and I. We looked at the sealed mountain. We knew what was behind that rock. We knew that Thomas and Eli were in there, preserved in the dark, maybe sitting in those stone alcoves in the lower chamber. We found one thing the marshal had missed. Near where the tool shed had stood, half buried in the churned earth, was a piece of the chalkboard Sparrow had used. It was cracked, but the charcoal drawing was still visible. It showed the pillar. The geometric lines. Connolly picked it up. He wiped the dust off it. They cleaned it up, he said. The creatures, they cleaned it up. Why? I asked. Because they don't want to be found, Connolly said. They aren't animals. They're smart. They know that if the world finds them, we'll bring an army. So they hide the evidence. They seal the breach. We left Nevada the next day. I never saw Connolly again. I heard he drank himself to death in a flophouse in Denver a few years later. Sparrow vanished. Some say he went to an asylum. Alvarez went back to Mexico. I am an old man now. I live in a city, far from the silence of the high desert. I have grandchildren. I have a life. But I don't sleep well. I keep the lights on. I keep the radio playing. Because when it gets quiet, when the traffic dies down and the house settles, I hear it. It is not in the walls, it is under the floor. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, it is faint. Patient. I know what they are. I know they were here before us. I know they are waiting for us to finish with the surface so they can have it back. The government knows. I've seen the survey maps from the 1950s. I've seen the restricted zones around that part of Nevada. They call it a testing ground now. They keep people away, but they can't keep the sound away. Sometimes late at night I put my ear to the floorboards and I tap back, 2 taps. And from deep in the earth, from miles down in the crushing dark, they answer.